Welcome to the Redhead Reveal podcast. I am Jenn Pinkerton, your Redhead host, a psychotherapist, high-performance coach, writer, and speaker. As a connection expert, I help people reveal their connectedness within relationships, transforming from the root causes of beliefs and behaviors that hold them back from thriving in life. Let's talk about how you're thriving. All right, I am so excited today to welcome Dr. Emily Jamea. Thank you for being here. We are going to talk about sex.
Yes, we are. I am so thrilled to be here. I mean, we've been connected for a long time.
Absolutely.
And so it's great to finally be sitting together talking about sex on the pod.
Me too. And this book, I have to just start out from the gates with this. Everyone can see Anatomy of Desire. This is amazing.
Thank you.
How long did it take you to write this book?
Oh my gosh, it kind of depends. I would say the idea loosely kind of came to me probably like 6-7 years ago, around the time I had my daughter, who's now 6. And I got the idea and I'm like, okay, but I need data. I have this theory, but that's all it was at that time, was a theory. And so I initiated a research study. It was actually my doctoral dissertation, and got really good results to kind of back up what I was theorizing, and started to formulate, kind of strengthen my hypothesis, narrow down my idea. I did a follow-up study looking specifically at the relationship between flow state and sexual satisfaction. Once I got that data, and I spent a lot of time interviewing my participants, I was like, there's just too much. Like, I've got to put this into a book. It's not all going to fit into just a research paper. And so it's been slowly growing over the past 6 years, I'd say.
And I think that was the time that you maybe, if I read correctly, did you step back a little bit to work on this or to spend more time at home? I kind of was reading some of that about these life stages you were going through in your practice.
It was kind of a weird time. Like, I was having my babies, and then COVID hit, and I was trying to expand my practice, and I wanted to write the book, and I was like, you know what they say, you can have it all, just not all at once.
That's
and I was like, something's got to give. And I have wanted to write a book forever. I mean, I think for me, it has just been kind of both a personal and career bucket list. And I was like, if I'm going to do this, I want to do it right. And so I was like, let me just slow down on trying to grow my practice. And I've got these little kids at home who I really want to spend some time with. And so, I just slowed. I had to pick something in life to slow down on. And I talk about that in the book. Like, so the whole first chapter is on sensuality and getting back in touch with your body, and how important that is as a precursor to surrendering to sexual pleasure. And so, I have to practice what I preach. And
That's right.
Yes.
Well, 15 years of experience helping people have connection, create passion. You're a sex and relationship therapist here in Houston, have your own practice. This book really, I thought, was so interesting because as I also am in this space, I often don't see books that are written in this way. And what I mean by that, for those of you that are listening and watching too, is that it's all about this connection with self and less about here's how we do these more clinical things.
Yep.
That we need to do if we feel like we don't have a great sex life.
Yes.
And it is a missing link. And I agree with you completely. And I was reading this going, yes, this is so amazing. And so I think I want to start with just talking about flow.
Yes.
And even defining flow, because that's such this core concept that runs throughout this book. So kind of educate us what flow is.
Sure. Well, I'll back up a little bit because this fed into the book and into my research as well. I had gotten to a point in my career where I could help people overcome things like erectile dysfunction, or help women have orgasms, or overcome painful sex. And I could help couples improve desire, but they'd come back sometimes just wanting more, more passion, more chemistry. And they'd always cite honeymoon stage sex as the kind of sex they longed for. And, at first I was quick to kind of just like, look, the honeymoon stage isn't sustainable. We can't sustain those neurochemical high forever. We never get anything done. But I started paying closer attention to the language that they were using. And they were using words like effortless and fully absorbed and lost in the moment. And I realized that they were using language that we use to describe a flow state. So for people who don't know, a flow state is the state of mind we get into when we are engaged in an activity in which we experience that loss of space and time. It has our complete attention and focus, full concentration. We kind of lose ourselves in the moment. Think of a surfer who describes being at one with the wave, or your friend who's addicted to the runner's high. And so I had learned about flow, earlier in my academic career. And I'm like, okay, well, yeah, that makes sense. Like, who wouldn't want to feel those things during sex? So I turned to the academic literature to see what I could find, and there was literally nothing out there that looked at the link between the two. And I'm like, how can this be? And so that's when I initiated the follow-up study to really look specifically at that link. And sure enough, people who were experiencing a flow state were having significantly higher levels of sexual satisfaction. And so then I called up the people who had the highest scores and I interviewed them to find out specifically what they were doing. And one of the most exciting things was that none of them talked about honeymoon stage sex as being the best sex of their relationship. They talked about sex that happened,
interesting.
Yeah, years in. And that's something I had read also in Peggy Kleinplatz's research on optimal sex. That was similar among her research participants. And so I'm like, there's something here, And so I started talking to more people and applying what I had learned from my research participants to my own clients. And they were just getting these amazing, life-changing results. And so now it's all here in the pages of this book.
And I love the concept of flow and the way you wrap this in, because I think many people who might not be comfortable talking about sex, which a lot of people are not.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, they're still having sex but not talking about it.
Right.
And that's that missing link. But with the flow state concept, I imagine a lot of people can identify with, when do I feel flow?
Yes.
And especially if they've never felt that with sex, but they can identify that with I'm when I'm golfing, or I think you used in the book rowing. When somebody is in the moment of something that they love, I think of, for me, that would be if I'm doing yoga. How I feel when I'm in that kind of almost euphoric state, but free and happy and feeling and experiencing pleasure, but in a very different way, in a non-sexual way.
Right.
And to me, I think that what is so spot on with this book is it would give people who have never thought about sex in that way a way to imagine, wow, I can't even think about how I could feel that way there and then that way also in sex.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I think that's really the key here is, I found a concept and an experience that most people can identify. There's a level of familiarity with it. And so then we just have to make that jump. And it turns out it's not a huge jump to translate that energy into sex. And so I really encourage people to think about everything they do when whatever their activity is that puts them into a flow state, and start to apply some of that to sex. Now, a lot of people think, okay, well, when I'm doing my activity, it's a solo activity. How does this fit, with a partner? And I always go to like a team sport. Think of any team sport or a group of musicians or an orchestra. Like, we have a lot of research on group flow, and we know that this can happen, not just with one person, but, entire stadiums of people. And so, a couple
shared energy
is shared energy. Exactly. And so I really think that as long as both people are invested in getting there, any couple is capable of having this kind of transformative, life-changing sex.
And I think it would particularly hit home if maybe people identify with the way they have sex now might be either performative, where there's really is that disconnect of emotional. There's no embodiment, and it's just performative. It's I'm going to do this so that you can feel pleasure. I'm going to feel pleasure. We're done.
Yeah.
And I think that so much of people's sex is wrapped up into that. I've always attributed that to, where did they learn about sex? What kind of sex did they learn?
Yes.
And it was more about, this is just what we're supposed to do,
right,
rather than what actually feels good to do.
Oh, yeah. I mean, we don't realize, I don't think, how strongly we latch on to some of these early messages we get about sexuality, particularly gendered expectations as it relates to sex. Like, if I were to tell women to read one chapter twice in the book, it would probably be the chapter on sensuality. And if I were to tell men to read one chapter twice, it'd probably be the chapter on vulnerability. Because, I think that...
Bam! That makes sense right there.
I think that, both men and women are socialized to think that sex is something done for a man, or that women don't really experience as much pleasure from a sexual encounter as men do, despite the fact that women can have multiple orgasms and most men can't do that. And men are socialized to believe that sex for them is not really emotional. But I have yet to have a guy in my office saying the reason he wants to have more sex with his wife is so that he can have more orgasms. I mean, that's something he could do on his own. It's for them, it's about the emotional connection. And but I think that a lot of times men don't even have the language or haven't given themselves the permission to make that link.
That's what I identify and think about as permission.
Yes.
It's the concept of men being, weak versus strong. And these ideals and thoughts that maybe haven't evolved enough as they should have. And the concept of that if you actually are vulnerable, it will be the strongest, the most powerful way to actually have sex for a man.
And the most complete for both. I mean, I talk about, how women can get more in touch with their assertive side and how men can get in touch with their softer side, and how if both men and women would do that, like we would bring more wholeness to a sexual encounter. And that's what makes it so great. I think when we show up to the bedroom, as fragmented if we're only bringing a small part of ourselves into the bedroom, of course we're going to feel bored after a while. We have to see sex as an opportunity to let all of our different facets shine through. And of course that can only be done within, I think a healthy, safe relationship. And we talk about that in the book, but
well, that's the basic framework.
Yes.
We have to start there. If we don't have emotional safety and physical safety and all those things, we're never going to be able to go to that next step, sexually.
Exactly.
It doesn't exist.
So important. And in the first study I did, when I looked at the relationship between sensuality and curiosity and sexual satisfaction, I also looked at attachment. And, people could be the most sensual, curious person in the world, but if they were not in a secure relationship, their sexual satisfaction score went down. So that is a really important piece of the puzzle. And we talk about that in the vulnerability chapter.
So the vulnerability chapter for men, obviously that makes a lot of sense. The embodiment idea, sensuality chapter for women, I think that brings in a lot of shame parts. And I'm curious to know kind of what you can say about women that carry shame and aren't comfortable with sensuality because of the messages of what that means.
So it's actually in the curiosity chapter where I really encourage people to start challenging some of the beliefs or ideas they may be holding that are preventing them from fully accessing, this really vital sexual part of themselves. But coming back to sensuality, I think for women in particular, one of the most common complaints I hear from them is that they can't slow their mind down enough to get in touch with their body.
The mental load.
The mental load, AKA the mental load. And so, that's something I think we have to be very mindful of. And, and we're talking about heterosexual couples primarily. And, but this can show up in all kinds of couples. If one person is responsible for all the stuff related to household and kids, and they both have full-time jobs, like, of course that chatterbox is going to have a harder time going quiet. And so I think that, you hear a lot about like mindfulness techniques, and mindfulness techniques are wonderful. I think mindfulness techniques are a step in the right direction. I write a lot more though about embodiment, and I think that takes it a step further. I really when I talk to my research participants, they talk about how mindfulness is almost distracting because it's that kind of ping pong effect of like, oh, there's an intrusive thought. Let me step away from it. Let me get back into my body. Oh, there's and you're kind of in that cycle.
It's constant work. Yes.
Exactly. Where people who are having this really optimal sex, and again, Peggy Kleinplatz found this in her participants as well, it's they let their bodies do the talking. It's like the mind kind of shuts down. So that phenomenon when the brain quiets down actually has a name. It's called transient hypofrontality, which basically means the prefrontal cortex is the part in the front of the brain where we have our higher order thinking, our higher cognitive skills. It's our rational thinking, decision-making, planning, that sort of thing. It's the chitter chatter, that's constantly activated. So when we experience transient hypofrontality, which happens when we're engaged in a flow state, regardless of what we're doing, that brain region they found in MRIs kind of goes quiet. And we're really just engaged with the more emotional, even reptilian part of the brain, which gives us
so you're more in the moment.
We're in the moment. You are in the present. You can't really think about anything else because that part of your brain isn't active, which, I mean, I don't know about y'all, but to me that sounds wonderful.
Absolutely.
To take a
Can we
break
tap
from
into
that.
this all day, every day?
I know, exactly. And so, for people to know that sex is an opportunity to get into that state of mind, I'm like, maybe we don't have to cross everything off the to-do list. Like maybe sex sex could be an opportunity to forget the world around us because, like I always tell my clients, the dishes will always be there. The laundry will always be there. But if you're not careful, the sexual spark won't. So you've got to cultivate it. Yeah. And you've got to, give it the time, energy, and attention that it deserves.
Well, and when you're saying this, I'm thinking the freedom that comes in that. To say, you know what, we can actually have sex. We're not just checking the box. We can go have sex to escape from everything else.
Yes.
Versus this is just one more chore. One more thing we have to remember if we're not doing it consistently, that our relationship is suffering. Instead, this is an actual opportunity for both of us to feel free, for both of us to be in the moment.
Yes. I think a lot of people think that everything has to be in perfect order in order for great sex to happen. But a lot of my research participants talked about, for example, some of the best sex being on the heels. One woman talked about how when her twin sister died, how she was in such this deep, dark grief, but how sex with her partner during that time kind of helped her reconnect with a feeling of aliveness and was so comforting for her and gave her an opportunity to forget what she was going through, even if it was, just a few minutes in time. Or another couple, had a child with special needs and how stressful and tiring that was with the additional therapy and counselors and so on and so forth, but how sometimes they would just connect in the middle of the night when the brain was kind of in that alpha theta wavelength and they're sleepy and the bodies would just do its thing. And that was really, a unifying experience opportunity for them. And so so much of this is about changing the mindset we have about sex.
Okay, so you've worked with thousands of people over the years to get to this place. What did you see was maybe the most common presenting concerns that got you to want to, write this book?
Desire. And it's not just me. I mean, when you look at the research in terms of what people come to sex therapy for, desire, discrepancy in desire, low desire is by far the most common and most complex issue that people come in with, because there can be, 5 different couples who are dealing with desire issues and 15 different reasons why they're experiencing them. There are just so many factors that influence our desire for sex. A lot of people want to just focus on the hormonal component. And yes, hormones play a little bit of a role, but they are such a smaller piece of the puzzle than we would like to give them credit for. I mean, everything pretty much affects our desire for sex. Right. So when a couple comes in with that complaint, I go into like Columbo mode, just trying to, figure out what may be going on for them specifically that is contributing to a shift or a disconnect.
Now, do you see more that people come because they've never felt the desire for their partner and sex has always maybe just been going through the motions, or we're just doing what we know we're supposed to do so each of us achieve an orgasm versus, maybe we had the desire and we lost it? Which one do you think is more common?
If I had to say, I'd say there are people who had it in the beginning, but that's all that neurochemical high. Right. It's the honeymoon phase. It's, it's like, that's why they call it falling in love. It's a very passive process. And then couples are ill-equipped to do the work that they need to do to make it an active process and
to stay in love.
To stay in love. Yeah. And to me, I feel like it's so much more special to feel desired by someone who's being intentional about it as to someone who's just doing it because they're having a temporary surge of dopamine. Like anyone with a beating heart can do that.
Exactly.
And so I am always working with people like this is not about getting back what you had in the early days. It's like, comparing a Picasso to a Rembrandt. Like we got to get into this deeper, there's intensity to be found in the later stages of a relationship through the intimacy that comes when you've been together and overcome obstacles together. And
the bond is stronger then too.
Exactly. The bond is stronger. That synchronicity, doesn't really come about till later, where you kind of can anticipate what each other is going to say. And I'm like, we got to translate that skill to the bedroom. There's such a focus, I think, on sexual communication and talking about likes and dislikes. And again, that is really important stuff.
Your yuck and yum list.
Yes, let's talk about it. But that's just a first step. Eventually, my couples, and I want to get people to a place where you don't have to talk about every little thing. Like the analogy
you're connecting.
Because it's that synchronicity. You're co-regulating. Think of, if a soccer team or a football team had to stop and talk through every single play in the middle. Like that just doesn't make sense. Like they practice beforehand, but eventually the team kind of moves as one unit and they can anticipate each other's moves, and they're almost doing without thinking. It feels automatic. And
I really like that analogy because I think that's helpful to think about that, especially maybe for men who this whole concept is a little more difficult in some ways, to be able to recognize, okay, let me relate it to that exact analogy of how this team is moving together. You anticipate that and you're jiving, basically.
I had to find some sports analogy to get the men on board.
It's true.
But it's so true. I mean, it's the same exact principles, and so men have to learn how to tune in to their partner. And I think, there are gender differences here. Men are not socialized to tune into nonverbal emotional cues as much as women are. So it's something, though, that they can learn. It's a developable skill, as long as they have some tools and know how to pay attention.
And the win here is to imagine, as we're going back to in the beginning, you're dating, everything's exciting, everything's we're falling, it's passive, it's just we're being swept off our feet kind of concept. But the win is if you can achieve that in the later years, in the time when that's all absence, in the time we've gone through maybe some trials and tribulations, when your relationship has been a little more difficult and you've actually had to work at it.
Yes.
Because we don't work at it in the beginning.
Yes.
If we did, we were usually saying next.
Right,
on.
exactly.
But you're having to work at it.
Yeah.
And then applying the same concept of maybe working on your sex life in a way where then you're free with your sex life.
Precisely. And that's what the whole adaptability chapter is about, because the sex you have in the early days is going to be different than the sex you have when you're trying to conceive, or when you have little kids, or when you've, blown your ACL and you can't get into the same position you're accustomed to. I mean, life happens, and really the couples who know how to navigate those hurdles and remain in sync despite some of these, issues that come up are the ones who are going to sustain long-term passion. The ones who have a very narrow, rigid sexual script, which by that I mean, they kind of have sex the exact same way every time, and they have the way they're used to doing things, are then ill-equipped to handle it when something comes in that throws a wrench into what they're used to.
Well, and that exact recipe of this is the way we do it. These are our emotions. Here's our script. I think sometimes if women want to go into a more of a sense of embodiment, they might feel reluctant because it is so outside of the norm. Is there an acceptance there? Right. There's an idea of, is my partner going to maybe reject that and not feel comfortable with that?
Right. And that's why, we have to have the awkward, hard conversations. That's why that is a first step. So many people will say, like, well, I don't want to do that because it's going to feel awkward. And I'm like, well, anything new feels a little awkward at first. Like, you've got to just lean into the awkwardness. And so when people ask me, like, how do I talk to my partner about this, that, or the other without it feeling awkward? I'm like, you don't. You tell them, hey, I feel awkward and uncomfortable having this conversation, but, I would like to know that you're open to hearing what I say and that you can be non-judgmental and receptive.
Be curious.
Be curious, exactly. And so, just putting that out there first, I think, who's going to say no? Like most
hope not.
people, let's hope not. I think if both people are invested in great sex, I would hope that they're both curious about what
we're
each other
dangling
needs.
a carrot, right?
Yeah.
This whole conversation is about great sex. So work with me here so we can get to that place where we both think we can have some mind-blowing intimacy.
Exactly. And, message to the women here, like it would benefit both of you, I think, to talk about specifically what your likes and dislikes are, because you're only going to want your desire for sex is only going to increase if the sex is worth wanting.
Yes.
Full stop.
Mic drop on that. That's really huge though, because how many people are in a sexual relationship and they don't talk about what they really don't like, that my partner does this every time.
Exactly.
But I just do it because that's what they do.
Of course you're not going to want to have sex if it's bad sex. Yeah. Like, we've got to work on the quality of the sex to make it worth desiring
Absolutely.
first.
So you talk in the book about I can't remember if it was 5 or 6, but it was the ingredients or the steps, basically. Can we just kind of go a little high level on those?
Yeah.
Because I'm trying to think how you worded it in here. Help me here, but I loved it. Because it was outlined in a way that was so clear and so concise that I think people who are reluctant to even talk about sex are going to be with it.
I wonder, so there's the 8 components of flow, but
That's it. It's the 8 components of flow is what I want to go with.
What I think you may be referring to are the 4 stages.
Okay, it's that.
Of flow.
That's what it is. That's what it is. Okay, that's what I want to get to. Because I thought it was 5. Okay. Give us the 4 stages of flow.
So the 4 stages are number 1, the struggle phase. Okay. This is where you're kind of overloading the brain with information. You actually have a flood of stress hormones. You're not at all relaxed. And this is where a bunch of people throw the towel in because, of course, if something feels stressful or makes you anxious a little bit, like you're not going to want to do it. But people who know that good things come to those who wait and move past the struggle phase then eventually land into the release phase. So the release phase is when those stress hormones begin to flood out, the body starts to enter into a state of relaxation, concentration starts to narrow a little bit. And then the 3rd stage is flow. That's where, everything clicks. You've got that total concentration, full absorption, loss of space and time. Time can seem to speed up or slow down. And then eventually when flow is over, you enter into the kind of recovery phase or integration phase where the neural connections are made and your brain will learn like what worked and didn't work that got you there. I was just in San Diego a couple weekends ago and I was watching the surfers. And, it's such a perfect, beautiful analogy
Absolutely.
Because, take a surfer in the struggle phase, they're waxing their board, they're stretching. I was watching this whole process, every day. They're stretching and paddling out. And they're kind of then sitting, that's the struggle phase, right? Like, they don't really know exactly if the right wave is going to come and they're paddling out. And then they have to sit around and wait for a while, and their mind is probably wandering. They may be thinking of what they have to do the next week or did I remember to water the plants or whatever, right? But then when they see that wave coming, they hop on their board and the world disappears and they are at one with the wave and they are in flow.
So taking the opportunity, seizing the moment, and then they're in it.
Exactly. And, I think we know from the research on focus that it takes people an average of like 14 minutes to be totally focused on something. And if concentration is broken, it takes people about 25 minutes to regain focus.
But you've just described sometimes a longer period than anyone ever even has sex. So
that's my point.
We're already way out of the game now.
Most people only have sex for like less than 10 minutes,
right.
So when it comes, and this is for women in particular, when it comes to focusing on sex, there are things you can do throughout the day to help get you ready for that. Trim the fat from your life, single task as much as possible is something I tell people, and then give yourself enough time to let arousal build and for relaxation to take hold and talk to your partner about what that looks like. It may mean that, you ask for a little bit of a massage or you just spend time lying in bed, caressing each other. Maybe you just take like literally 90 seconds and do some deep breathing. Like just do something to help yourself transition from the craziness of the day into the erotic realm. Like you just cannot expect to go from 0 to 60 with the flip of a switch.
Exactly.
Our brains don't work like that.
That's why I've always talked about hotel room sex.
Yes.
And for that exact reason.
Yes.
You're away from home. You're away from the mental load. You're away from the to-do list. You're away from all that. You're already, hopefully, in more of a relaxed state.
Yes.
Everything seems a little calmer. And then you're in a different place.
Yes.
It's
got
changed
the novelty.
It's novelty. It's curiosity. This is kind of fun. What are we going to do while we're here?
Right.
And we have the time to actually focus on each other. And newsflash, this is what we're supposed to be doing because this is why we chose the getaway.
Right.
So I think it's the permission aspect with that too.
Yes,
we have
and the
permission.
preparation. And do you have to do all of those things to have flow state sex? I don't think so. For sure not. I talk to my couples and, they don't have it every single time. I mean, most people wouldn't have it every single time. But I think if every now and then you're like, okay, we want to have really great sex because it's been a while and maybe we feel a little bit disconnected or it's just kind of been that run-of-the-mill sex, then people will know what to do to create conditions to have it. And then that energy carries over into the next several encounters that you have. So
and I like to mention that because the more sex you're having, then the more sex you're having.
Yes,
it is this domino effect. And it takes, I think, the idea of people recognizing there are these active things you can do in this book, active items that if you're going to go here, then you're going to see this long term. It's not going to be, okay, we're going to have this one great moment and we had great desire, great sex today. No. This is going to mean that your sex life is better over time.
Yes.
Just from doing a few different things. These small tweaks
Right.
can really have such a big difference and impact.
It's so true. I mean, this is why, there's too much out there about tips and tricks. And,
Right.
that's not really what people talked about when they talked about the best sex they have. They talked about this really subtle nuance that they felt unique to their sex life. But, then I as I interviewed more people, I saw these themes emerge. And that's what's in the book.
But the tips and tricks cause people to stay in their head.
Exactly.
And so there can't be this embodiment. There can't be this sensuality. We're not going to have the synchronicity, all the words you're talking about, if we're just in our head the whole time.
It's superficial. It's fun. Do it, every now and then. But I like to take people a bit deeper than that.
Well, that depth is what's going to actually sustain a relationship.
Yes.
You can have a little bit of fun. You can have even the performative type sex. You can do all these things, but that's not going to strengthen a bond. It's not going to maintain connection. And you're not going to feel that intimacy in that way.
It's not going to nourish you.
Yes.
The way you
I
want.
love that. Yes.
I think the other stuff is candy. Like this is what's going to keep you full.
Yeah. I think that's a great analogy. So, I think that everything we've covered today is really eye-opening for people, and I love that it's done in such a simplistic way of being able to grasp it. So, I'm definitely going to be sharing my copy with a lot of people here. Is there any lasting message, one message you want to leave for anybody who's picking up this book, who's recognizing they're having this lack of desire, something you want to leave them with?
Just that it's worth it. Sex is so much more than a juxtaposition of body parts. It is an opportunity for, of course, physical pleasure, but more than that, self-expression and relationship connection. And, with the right tools and when you get into a flow state, I think transcendence. And so it's worth the energy.
I think it's worth it too. Okay, well, something we do on the podcast is the prior guest leaves a question for the new guest and vice versa. So I'm going to give you your guest question.
Okay.
Our last guest said, if you were a flavor of ice cream, what would you be and why?
Ooh, okay. I used to work at Baskin-Robbins in high school, so I know all the flavors. I think I would go with chocolate chip cookie dough.
Okay, why?
Because here's why. I feel like every bite you get, a little bit of chocolate chip, a little bit of crunch. It's not just vanilla. There's some, other flavors mixed in. But then you kind of keep digging, and when you get that bite of cookie dough, like you stop and you savor it. And I feel like for me personally, I love those moments with people when you just kind of stop and savor, and it goes a bit deeper, obviously. That's what my book is about.
I love that answer.
So,
awesome.
you keep things fun and entertaining, but we all have depth to us. And I think whenever we can tap into that, we should stop and do so.
That's great. All right. What question would you like to leave for our future guest?
It would be, let's see. What's one thing you do in life that gives you a sense of effortlessness, ease, loss of space and time that puts you into a state of flow?
That's great. And I will be circling back with you and letting you know what that next guest says. And,
yes,
maybe that next guest is going to have to buy this book to help them get
exactly,
there. Anyway, thank you so much. I really appreciate having you here. Anatomy of Desire, everybody. You've got to run and get this book. It was wonderful. It was a great conversation.
Thanks so much.
All right.